for a tafsir. It's called Tafseer Qurtubi, which would actually go into a little bit more details in the definitions and stuff. And then I would go into a more detailed tafsir, which is called the Tahrir wa Tanweer. So one detail after another, try to expand, try to which would actually go into a little bit more detail. It tries to, yeah.
I quit all my classes to focus on this.
In the what was that? And
stuff. All my classes.
And then, so what I try to do is, like I said, try to expand little by little to see how much. Now, this page was probably one of the hardest pages for me to figure out. And this page today was probably the hardest page for me to figure out, because how do I relate it with the previous pages? So it wasn't, I didn't get the connection from the first tafsir, second tafsir. It wasn't until I went to the fourth tafsir that I was able to figure out those connections. All right. In the first tafsir, that was Tafsir Ibn Kathir. It was more giving me the details of the ayat, the details of the context for the ayat, etc. But it still wasn't taking me to the context that it was actually mentioned in based on the previous ayat. So that's why, it took me some time to actually figure out those hidden things. So let's just see first the ayat that we were doing last time. Okay, let's just go over the ayat that we were doing last time. So the ayat that we were doing last time was actually talking about the order that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the malaika. And we talked about what makes a civilization, and we talked about what it means to be Khalifa. Remember that? And then we went in details about the different conditions of a Khalifa, or let me say the different commandments, the different reasons to why man was created. And we talked about to construct, we talked about what it means to implement justice, and we talked about what it means to do that comprehensive term of ibadah and worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we said how the malaika were considering themselves as deserving that even more. And we talked about how the malaika regarded themselves as having the right to be the ones that are Khalifa. And then we went further and we said what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had talked about giving Adam, and not giving the other creatures, not even the malaika, which was simply il-bayan, intellect, or the ability to speak, or the ability to understand, in other words, the cognitive skills. All right. So we talked about some of those things, and then we talked about how that story in scenario 1 was actually connected with scenario 2, which is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders the malaika to make sujood for Adam, who does not obey the order. It was Iblis. Iblis was not part of the malaika, was actually part of the jinn. Iblis certainly did not want the order because he regarded himself as superior to Adam, because he regarded himself as having a different quality that Adam doesn't have. He regarded that his quality of containing energy, of course, when we're talking about energy, he regarded, well, my body and quality in my physical creation is superior. That's why he said, خَلَقْتَهُ مِنْ نَارٍ وَخَلَقْتَنِي مِنْ طِينٍ. You created him from clay, you created me from nar. You created me from nar, which is supposed to be fire, which is supposed to be a form of energy. Therefore, I should be better. Then we continue to talk about the scenario 3 in the story, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells Adam that he's got a number of different things that are guaranteed from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on a condition. So number 1 is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guarantees that he would have a peaceful, tranquil life, and of course that there would be that social what's it called, stability And of course, that there would be the resources in order for them to continue and bring about a stable life. And we talked about those pieces. In other words, in order to live in this world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us a number of different things we talked about. We're just summarizing here in order to really be the ones, the Khalifa, to bring about one, the construction, the social justice, and in order to implement the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that all those different elements are really what are going to bring about the social stability, which is sukoon, which is that stability. Number two, it will actually have a fair distribution in resources. And of course, there's only one condition in order to have those things met. In other words, in order to have social stability and social justice, and in order to have a fair distribution, the resources are there. But in order to have that fair distribution, there is the condition to actually follow the instructions that the Lord Almighty had set for people. So that is right there in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was giving Adam a very primitive and a very small understanding of what it actually means to apply the word of Allah Almighty. So it was, well, right there, you've got a wife that should give you, a sustained living, that should give you the ability to get some level of stability. You also have the resources, but on a condition that you make sure that you don't eat from the tree. And of course, not eating from a tree is a very primitive, you'd want to say, and I don't mean by primitive as a very low. This is not what I mean by primitive. Primitive means a very simple sharia. It wasn't as complex as the different shari'as that later came onto the other prophets. All right. So don't misunderstand the word primitive and think that here we're trying to bring about a form of condescending the sharia that was put on Prophet Adam alayhi salam. This is not to say such, but this is to actually say it was a very simple form of sharia. In other words, sharia itself and the sharia that Prophet Adam was ordered to do was simply just a one piece of that sharia, which is not to eat from the tree. Now, not eating from the tree was that simple sharia that he was supposed to apply, but of course that was not implemented by Prophet Adam. Yet he was not a prophet when he had actually eaten from the tree. And we talked about how shaitan azallahuma, which means that he gave a narrative, and the narrative that the shaitan had given them is that awala adulluka ala shajaratil khuldi wa mulkin la yabla. Should I not show you off to a tree that will give you the ability to live eternally and give you the great possession? In other words, you'll have a full ownership over everything. In other words, and you'll complete your property by also not only containing everything, but putting that tree as part of your property as well. So that's what Iblis wanted to tell him. It's like, yes, that is your property, but you will actually have a more magnificent or a bigger property if you included that tree within the property. So that was the narrative that Iblis wanted to say. Now, Iblis right there gives him that narrative. Adam and Hawa both fall for the narrative, and then eventually that was the lesson. The whole theme is that for Adam, after Adam recognizing and realizing that he has the intellect, he has the ability to communicate, then it was another lesson for him to learn. Lesson number 3 is that بَعْضُكُمْ لِبَعْضٍ عَدُوٌّ. Now you had realized that you've got certain feelings towards, or you've got certain pleasures, and that Iblis was going to be there to give you certain narratives in order to get you off the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now it is time for you to recognize that, yes, you, although have the capacity to recognize the things around you, but you could easily fall for a narrative that will take you off the recognition of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had instructed. All right. So this is really important. So although you're able to recognize with intellect and science and understanding all the different things around you, but there's one piece that your mind might actually be very limited in understanding, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's instructions. All right. So that's where Adam had actually realized, that's when he realized that his capacity falls short on some of the parts in understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's instructions and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's orders. So that's where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him that lesson before he's actually sent from the Jannah to earth. He's actually given one final lesson before you go down. بَعْضُكُمْ لِبَعْضٍ عَدُوٌّ. Now you recognized Iblis. Now you recognized that there is another recognition that you're coming into this dunya. Yes, a khalifa, but you're coming in this dunya with an enemy, with a recognition that you're actually responsible and that you're created to be tested. When is there an enemy? There's always, whenever there's an enemy, all right, there's an innocent person. Whenever there's an enemy, there is an enemy to what? There's a standard. All right. Why is there an enemy? Well, that means they trespassed. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling him, well, wait a minute. Now you realize that you've got an instruction. You realize that you were created for a purpose. Now you realize that, yes, you've got the intellect, you've got certain capacities, but you have to recognize also that there's that instruction that you must follow in order to gain, number one, stability and social justice. Second, the resources and to be able to have a fair distribution. Number three is that is actually connected and related on how you consider the instructions and the obligations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you. So let's continue. وَلَكُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ مُسْتَقَرٌّ وَمَتَاعٌ إِلَىٰ حِينٍ. An emphasis on the previously mentioned part. وَلَكُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ مُسْتَقَرٌّ. And on earth you shall have mustaqar. The word mustaqar actually means a place of qarar, a place of dwelling. In other words, you should have all the necessary elements for any stable life. In case there is any kind of an injustice taking place, it's not because the earth was not given the different elements needed for such justice to take place. It's that man has gone off the instructions and has gone off the paradigm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set for him. Got it?
Yep.
Now, وَمَتَاعٌ إِلَىٰ حِينٍ. مَتَاعٌ إِلَىٰ حِينٍ. That is not going to be eternal, but that's going to be for a limited part of time. In other words, as man, you were given a time to live in between in order to get tested. That's مَتَاعٌ إِلَىٰ حِينٍ, which actually ends with death. All right? فَتَلَقَّى آدَمُ مِنْ رَبِّهِ كَلِمَاتٍ فَتَابَ عَلَيْهِ. Now, Adam then gets the instructions from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Adam then, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, تاب عليه. Adam then repents to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts his tawbah. And then, إِنَّهُ هُوَ التَّوَّابُ الرَّحِيمُ. But here's one thing. Now, I want you to look at this piece because I loved Tahir ibn Ashur. He connected this one with this one in such a beautiful way. And he said, so here he said, وَقُلْنَا اهْبِطُوا بَعْضُكُمْ لِبَعْضٍ عَدُوٌّ. Why say قُلْنَا اهْبِطُوا مِنْهَا جَمِيعًا the second time? So he explained that, he said, because قُلْنَا اهْبِطُوا بَعْضُكُمْ لِبَعْضٍ عَدُوٌّ, after he had eaten from the tree and after he had committed the sin, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then lets him drop in the level that he was in. Is it a fall in status? Is it a fall in place, literally, in where he moves from one place to another? So there are differences of opinions between scholars, but at the end of the day, is that whether it's a fall in status or whether it's a fall in place, at the end of the day, we could see that the ayah literally said, ihbitu, which means go down. You're coming down from a place to another. If it means that it was talking about place, so changing the place from one place to another, that would mean from the place of Jannah, which is the Jannah that we would know, the Jannah paradise, into earth. If we were to say that it was ihbitu in status, that would mean that they had come down from the level of deserving Jannah to a level of being tested. Now, here's the thing. They already were tested from not eating from the tree. So how is it that they were actually in the Jannah when we know that there's no test in Jannah? Regardless of the whole dialogue that is between, and let me call it controversy between scholars on whether it was the Jannah paradise or whether it was the Jannah in a garden, whether that was a status or whatever it is, I loved a very important note that Tahir ibn Ashur said. He said, the first one, قُلْنَا اهْبِطُوا بَعْضُكُمْ لِبَعْضٍ عَدُوٌّ, that was a lesson that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was giving Adam. He said, okay, so you ate from the tree. Now you recognized your mistake. The recognition deserved a lesson to note. That's helpful for parenting. Now you recognized your mistake. Parenting, just like parenting, in where, all right, so you recognize your mistake, but it's not enough to recognize the mistake in parenting. And the same thing how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually did it for Adam. He said, no, you also have to see the impact of your mistake. It's not enough. You have to take the responsibility of correcting your mistake. It's not enough to say, oh, you learned the lesson. I'm so happy for you, and let it pass as if nothing had happened. No, you're going to pay a price. And here's the price that Adam will pay. And so will we. قُلْنَا اهْبِطُوا مِنْهَا جَمِيعًا. Here's the price to pay. Here's the implication of the mistake that was committed. قُلْنَا اهْبِطُوا مِنْهَا جَمِيعًا. Not only did you recognize this report in where you realize that that you're going to be enemies to one another, that you're going to be getting some waswas, some evil inspiration from the shaitan, if that could even be called an inspiration, but there's going to be that note that's going to constantly give you a narrative to make it seem as if it was the right thing to do. So then, قُلْنَا اهْبِطُوا مِنْهَا جَمِيعًا. So now, all of you are going to go down in status into a different life. Here's the test. فَإِمَّا يَأْتِيَنَّكُمْ مِنِّي هُدًى. Now, فَإِمَّا, in case, يَأْتِيَنَّكُمْ, whenever you would get any guidance from me, who's that? That's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَمَنْ تَبِعَ هُدَيْ, then whoever follows my guidance, فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ, then they shall not taste fear. There should be no fear for them, and they should not feel the sorrow or sadness. Well, wait a minute. What does that have to do with anything? Let's get our little marker right there and actually connect the dots. Ready, you guys? Let's look at it. So why did it actually say khawf? And what does khawf and fear have to do with anything at all? We're going to take this down right there. And I want to look at this. I know for the people on YouTube, it's not going to be that clear. But here's the thing. When you look at khawf, what is the opposite of khawf? It's basically sakan, tranquility. What's the opposite of huzn? Don't move the table. What's the opposite of huzn? What is it? Well, it's when you actually have an abundance of good stuff around you, then you're feeling the pressure, then you're feeling happy. Right? Isn't that something? You got the resources, you've got a car, you've got a house, you've got the food, you've got the water, you've got everything. That should actually give you some level of feeling pleasure. So let's see, what does that actually mean? Let's look at it. So you could see these two elements. Let's reread this one. قُلْنَا اهْبِطُوا مِنْهَا جَمِيعًا. Now you're all going down into this earth. if any of you, in other words, if you would receive a message, Huda. So what is Huda? Huda is basically all that includes in ibadah, all that is included in hidayah, all that is included in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent with the wahi, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent with the wahi with Jibreel alayhi salam, which is what? What does the wahi actually contain? The wahi contains two things, the Eman, the faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it also contains the instructions, which is Sharia. Contains the different things. In other words, in order to bring about any type of stability, it's not enough to have a faith on the inside, but you also have to apply certain instructions in your own life. But that's not only on an individual level, but that's the same even on a community level. If you don't actually apply the right vision in life, which is Eman, well, the result is going to be the wrong application even in the definition of justice. Are you guys with me here? Let's go back a little bit with philosophy. You guys ready? If you're not ready, just give yourself a little shake. Ready? I like that.
You connected khawf and sukun how?
We're gonna get khawf and sukun. If there is khawf, there is no sukun. Okay. If there is huzun, there's going to be lack of fair distribution. When do you feel the sorrow? When you feel injustice is taking place, right? When do you feel it? There's injustice. I'm feeling that someone is crossing over me. Someone's crossing their limits. I'm not getting the needs, that whether it's the needs for a sustainable life, or whether it's the things that I need to live my life. What do I become? Struggling for survival, right? The struggle for survival. What does it create? It creates chaos, right? Now that chaos is what creates huzun, right? That's what creates huzun. So here we go, these elements connecting together. But here's the thing, is that when you actually look at this one, remember right there, so we're looking at Huda, all right? And we talked about Huda in terms of an individual level and the Huda in terms of a community and society level. So what does that even have to do with anything? That would actually mean that whenever you want to discuss any idea, all right, it's so common that people would talk about, for example, let's take feminism, all right? Many times people, when they would discuss feminism, they're just talking about probably maybe talk about abortion, fair pay, equal pay. You know, they would talk about those elements on the side rather than actually talk about the main epistemology of the idea. What makes the idea and what brings the idea? What makes the idea as a valid idea from the very source of it? You cannot discuss the details, but you got to go back to the main philosophy that made the idea what it is.
The origin of the thought.
Origin of the thought. The origin of the thought is the epistemology. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that Huda, guidance, that's why he said, فَإِمَّا يَأْتِيَنَّكُم مِّنِّي هُدًى, that true guidance is actually coming from wahi in defining morality, or in defining economical justice, or when defining any type of justice, whether you want to go into social or economical and whatever it is. In the end, if it's not based on Huda from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that's going to be a form of jahiliyyah. What does that mean? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, remember the whole law that we always put forward. Who remembers it? Come on, you guys, remember it. I always say it. Hamza should say it. What are the three things in epistemology in Islam? يتبعون إلا الظن وما تهوى الأنفس ولقد جاءهم من ربهم الهدى. Right? Three different resources for knowledge, for ma'rifah. It's either going to be dhann, or it's going to be hawa, or it's going to be wahi. Let's do it again.
You never taught us this.
No, I always say it to the point that I'm feeling that people are sick of me and sick and tired of me of repeating the same thing over and over.
No, this
So
one, no.
this is really important.
Okay, say
إن يتبعون إلا الظن وما تهوى الأنفس ولقد جاءهم من ربهم الهدى. All right. So what actually led to any delusion in understanding whether we're talking about the vision of life, which makes up Eman, or whether we're talking about the Sharia, which is morality, which is legislature. Any type of delusion in applying in legislature or in applying in vision, any legislature that you have is actually based on a vision of how you view life. All right. That's why when you look at, for example, postmodern, the postmodern Sharia of today, where everything is relative. Why? Because atheism regards that man was created matter in motion. So therefore, there is no definition for any type of morality, because anyways, there is no reason for life. So that's why they actually went that route. All right. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you that when you look at legislature, in terms of the origin of the idea, it either comes from dhann, which is speculation, or it comes from hawa, which is it desires an inclination, or it's going to come from wahi, or it's going to be coming from the huda, the guidance from Jibreel, from the prophets, from the messengers. In other words, the origin is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You see it right there? So when you look at these resources, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, wait a minute. Now you look at, if you get the guidance, then these things are to be crossed out. Speculation, whether you wanted to say David Hume, you wanted to call it Descartes, you wanted to say Kant, whatever it is, Kant and whatever it is, in the end, they're actually following dhann. When you look at the different philosophies and how we understand ethics or how we understand morality or whatever it is, in the end, it's going to be based on dhann. What is dhann? Whether you went and said, well, John Locke considers property, liberty, and all these different things as the main things to actually bring about a sustainable society. So then we'll say, wait a minute, this is within dhann if it's not based on guidance. What about hawa? Hawa is simply lobbying, simply culture. That makes hawa a group of people creating within you the desire to want a certain practice to become predominant by making it what? Beautifying it for you, that it's going to bring you desire. It's going to bring you happiness. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, wait a minute. Remember Adam, he actually had the desire to control, the desire for property, and ate from the tree. Wasn't that the narrative? That was the narrative. So here we go. We look at these elements. Let's do it again. Dhann, hawa, and wahi. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dismantled these parts of it by saying, well, listen, look at the narrative of dhann, speculation. Iblis gave the narrative that tree was going to actually get him a greater property, a greater governance than what he initially had. What did he do? Well, he put a speculation. He gave him a narrative to make some idea by looking at consequence as if it is actually a valid opinion or a valid argument. However, he played on using his inclination to want property and then made his hawa be the source of knowing truth and finding and recognizing truth. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, now that you had realized how dhann can be very manipulative, and now that you realize that hawa can also manipulate you into even bearing you within your own desires and bearing you within a wrong consequence that will take you somewhere else. Well, now that you're going to recognize in terms of epistemology, in terms of what makes a valid argument, the valid argument is going to be coming from wahi. Got it?
Yep.
Now let's see what else it continues to say. Now, and of course, this is not only on an individual level, but this is also on a society, universal, international level. You go on and on and on. In the end, is that if you follow the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is the key element to keeping fear and, of course, sadness and sorrow away from the society. What makes fear? What makes fear? What makes fear is the social instability. Now, here's the thing, is that فَمَنْ تَبِعَ هُدَايَ فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ. There are some scholars that said that فَمَنْ تَبِعَ هُدَايَ فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ. They said that whoever follows the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would not feel fear. And what they regarded was fear is that in this dunya. Why? Because they will know that rizq is from Allah. They would know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is capable of giving them life or taking it away from them. They won't be afraid because they know that all the resources, all the power is actually in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they actually connected it with the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually tells Abdullah ibn Abbas, that's the story. Abdullah ibn Abbas was just a 10-year-old boy. He's the Prophet ﷺ's cousin, was riding on the horse with the Prophet ﷺ right behind him, or maybe in front of him. Actually, it was actually behind him because the hadith says, Kuntu radifa Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so he was behind him. And he said, so the Prophet ﷺ said, Ya ghulam, O son, or O young boy, احفظ الله يحفظ. Preserve the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will preserve you. What does it mean to preserve the words? It means to put them into practice. It means to put them into practice. يحفظك, He will preserve you. احفظ الله تجده تجاهك. Preserve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will find Him wherever you need Him. Whenever you need Him, wherever you need Him, you will find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala there. احفظ الله تجده تجاهك. إذا سألت فاسأل الله. If you need to ask anyone, request anything, then request it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وإذا استعنت فاستعن بالله. And if you need to seek refuge in anyone, then seek it in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, don't condescend yourself. Don't lower your honor by asking anything from anyone. Preserve your honor and know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gives you honor. Don't lessen and don't lower your honor by letting others feel that what you need is in their hands. When you give anyone the feeling that what you need is in their hands, they will take advantage of you. They will find ways to take advantage of you, and they will find ways to abuse your need. Preserve your honor.
Give them power.
Of course.
You open the gate.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what is He telling you? He's telling you the power is really in you. The power is really in you. The power is not in their hands. Don't be manipulated by thinking that they have what you need. They don't have what you need.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Wahi with Salah. Salah is fard.
Mhm.
So you're supposed to pray 5 Salahs in time, right? I was
أشرب على يميني. Yep. Go ahead.
So saying Salah, the 5 salawats are fard.
Mhm.
Wahi says you have to pray your 5 salahs in fard. So
Right.
any minute you miss one, there's huzn.
Absolutely. So in
I just
general,
wanted to because a lot of us, we think we're far away from feminism, but it's the simple things like your 5 salahs is fard. I missed my asr. I came here feeling dead. Because I was running.
So in
But I should have
general,
prioritized.
so this is actually, it's like a general qaida. What's a general qaida? A general qaida is that you've got a whole general legal maxim. It's a whole maxim in where it actually includes every detailed or general ruling in Islam. What does that mean? The farther people are away from the standards, from the paradigms, from the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more fear there will be living in. The more they are distant from the sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well, the more sorrow that they will be in. Unfortunately, although not all depression is definitely a result of bad Eman, there's no doubt about that. No doubt about that. So not every single person that's going through depression is necessarily going to be fitting within a generalized thing and say, well, it's because of your low Eman. But part of it is true. Absolutely. Part of it is true. There is some depression that is actually a result of low Eman and a low practice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's instructions. It doesn't mean that at the same time, this doesn't mean that every single person that's going through depression is going to be considered that, hey, it's because of your low Eman. But low Eman does increase in the rate of depression, in the rate of sorrow, in the rate of loneliness, in the rate of feeling closed on the inside. Why? That's al-khuwa al-ruhi. Al-khuwa al-ruhi. It's the emptiness that you would feel on the inside. So where do we actually get that? What's the evidence? Well, remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the reason why he said وَلَهُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was actually telling us right there, then when you look at وَلَهُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ, is actually putting it in perspective that not move it more. Now, وَلَهُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ is when you look at il-huzn, it is actually right there, giving it right there. He was supposed to be getting the sukoon. He was supposed to be getting the resources. He was supposed to be given even the place. حَيْثُ شِئْتُمَا. So let's look at it. We're talking about what you need on the inside. Sukoon, husband, wife, family, the resources, and space. Even space is important. When you're only supposed to be, for those that lived in other countries, you know very well when you're limited in space, how much that actually limits the resources, limits your freedom, limits so many different things. You know that. We lived it in Palestine. Limiting space is another form of killing people. It creates depression within them when you limit their space. And that's why وَلَهُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us right there that when you actually apply these things with fair distribution, you apply it even in applying the sharia, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sharia, that's when you're going to actually get the limits that are going to give you a sustainable life. Now at the same time, فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ can also include لَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ in this dunya and in the akhira. So not only are they not feeling fear in this dunya, but they're also not feeling fear in the akhira. In other words, it's peace on the inside. You taste the Jannah in this dunya, you'll taste the Jannah in the akhira. What is Jannah all about? Jannah is all about feeling peace anyways. You feel it here, you feel it there. It becomes a path. وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. They don't feel the sadness here. Why? Because they know that the power is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not anybody going to abuse their need for it. وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. And even in the akhirah, they won't feel al-huzn. Why? Because all the different pains that will take place in the akhirah are going to be on the heads of those that had distanced themselves away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's continue. وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا وَكَذَّبُوا بِآيَاتِنَا. Well, let's see. What does that, what is the, let's look at it right there and give it just a little zoom in. وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا وَكَذَّبُوا بِآيَاتِنَا أُولَئِكَ أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. What is that even telling us here? That for those that would follow the guidance, they don't have these. What does that mean? The people that had rejected and denied. What's the difference between kafaru and kadhabu? So kafaru بآياتنا وكفروا وكذبوا بآياتنا. Kafaru, they rejected the idea of Tawheed. They rejected Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. كذبوا بآياتنا. Why كذبوا بآياتنا? Because when you talk about social justice, you're actually talking about legislature. You're talking about ethics. Anybody can claim that they can have their definition of what it means to have social justice, what it means to be right or wrong, what makes a fair social relationship, or what makes a fair economical distribution. Anybody can claim that they can have that. So when they actually denied, or here they rejected Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the vision, because remember what we said earlier, the vision of what you view about Allah or akhira, or even who you are, what your purpose of life is, that is going to have its result in how you make the understanding and how you define legislature. Am I going too much of a jargon here? Jen, are you lost? No, I'm good. Okay, good. Alhamdulillah. All right. So when you look at the main origin of the vision, then you're talking about how you understand legislature. What makes something as good or something ethical or not ethical. So here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that in terms of vision, they actually denied Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why كَذَّبُوا بِآيَاتِنَا, that's why that resulted in how they denied and they rejected what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had stated in terms of ethics and legislature. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَذَّبُوا بِآيَاتِنَا, they rejected, they denied, they regarded it as not applicable. So here, أُولَٰئِكَ أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ, those are the people that will be, the word ashab actually means الملازمة. الملازمة means to be in partnership with something. So what does that mean? These people, let's look at it. They denied Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They denied the legislature in practice. So what is the result? Well, the result is not like these people that will not fear and sorrow or sadness, but the result is that they will actually feel the fear. They will also feel the sorrow, and including that they will actually be the ones to be partners with hellfire.
Is it companions?
Partnership or companionship. And then hum fiha khalidun. What is that going to be? Eternally. They're going to stay there forever and ever. So what does that even have to do in terms of difference? Why did it? Time to eat. All right. So what does that even, why did it even talk about hum fiha khalidun? Because it told you before that life was mata'un ila hin. That life was very temporary. Life is temporary. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, hum fiha khalidun on the other side is that was this temporary life really worth losing what they will be there eternally? You guys see the connections?
Yep.
I'm trying to emphasize the coherence in the ayat. Am I able to do that yet?
Yes.
Okay, good. Alhamdulillah. Let's move on. Now يا بني إسرائيل. Now let's continue. يا بني إسرائيل اذكروا نعمتي التي أنعمت عليكم وأوفوا بعهدي أوفي بعهدكم وإياي فارهبون. How did we get into بني إسرائيل? Let's look at it right there. Remember, in the previous ayat, let's look at it. In the previous ayat, all right, we said that Alif Lam Mim, ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه, and then it brought out the mu'minin, and then it brought out the kafirin, those that are from the polytheists that are not from Ahl al-Kitab, and then it brought in the munafiqeen, right? Talked about the munafiqeen, and then it talks about Adam alayhi salam as the origin of the story, and then it talks about Ahl al-Kitab. Are you starting to get sleepy?
No.
Okay, good. So then it talks about Ahl al-Kitab. So let's continue. after seeing those parts of it, now talking about Ahl al-Kitab, Ya Bani Israel. Oh, Bani Israel. Who's Israel? Israel is Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam. Okay, sorry, it doesn't want to write right. Okay, Israel is Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam. Although there are differences of opinions on the word Israel and what it means, regardless, what does it mean Abdullah or what does it really mean? In the end is that he was also named Israel, and the word Yaqub, just like Israel, is not an Arabic name, but a Hebrew name, regardless of what it means. Udhkuru ni'mati. So it's talking about the Bani Israel. What did Bani Israel have to do with this anyways? What Bani Israel had to do with this is that when the Prophet ﷺ moved to Medina, Bani Israel, specifically the Yahud in Medina, had actually rejected Islam, even though they were the ones to enlighten the pagan Arab about the Prophet ﷺ. The Arab were the ones that actually, the Yahud, the Jews in Medina, were actually in Medina because they had anticipated, based on the prophecies in the Old Testament or in the Torah, that there's going to be a prophet coming. Well, they gave that enlightenment to the Arab at the time. And that's why the Arab that were living under the Jewish power in Medina. Wait a minute, Jewish power in Medina? Yes. The Jews were experts in choosing the geographical, or let's call it the areas in the ones that produce money. So in other words, what do they call it? Like a good geographical area. What do they call it? Forgot what it's called. Forgot what it's called. But it's a geographically speaking, Medina had certain areas that were more fertile than others. The Yahud were perceived by the Arab as more educated. In fact, the Yahud would actually send the children to learn from the Jewish rabbis because they were the ones that were educated. The Arab, the two pagan tribes that were living in Medina, the Aus and the Khazraj, were actually living under the Jewish power. In fact, they were considered the laborers under the Jewish power. The Jews were actually considered the ones with the money, the ones to own the great areas or the most fertile areas, and that's why they owned the money. Now, when the Jews had actually lived in Medina, they were telling the pagan Arabs that there was going to be a prophet coming in, and that eventually they will unite and be with this prophet, and that they will eventually rule the Arab. In other words, not only will they be laborers for the Jews, but they will be even in a worse situation. Now, the Arab were putting their children to learn from the Yahud. Keep that, learn from the Yahud, because the Arab, being pagan, they didn't have that source of ilm. The source of ilm really comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the most important thing. So what happened? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Prophet ﷺ becomes a prophet, the Arab, by coincidence or by qadar, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala let some of the Arab actually meet the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca. The Prophet ﷺ was speaking with different people to tell them about Islam, but of course he was rejected, especially in the Ta'if, where he even gets stoned by the children there. The Prophet ﷺ continues finding a place that would embrace Islam and embrace the Muslims. But it isn't until he meets part of the Medina citizens and part of the Medina residents that they would actually introduce the Prophet ﷺ to Medina and even move to Medina. The Prophet ﷺ just tells them about Islam, but they recognize this, said, this is the Prophet that the Yahud were telling us about. So what happened? When the Prophet ﷺ moved to Medina, the Yahud were not excited whatsoever because they considered that he was not part of the tribes or any of the children of Israel's tribes. So therefore, he shouldn't be a valid prophet. All right? He shouldn't be a valid prophet. Not all the Yahud had necessarily rejected. There were a number of Yahud that accepted Islam. Part of them was Abdullah ibn Sallam, who was actually called who was actually one of the rabbis of the Jews in Medina, and there was also Ibn al-Harith as well. So they were also rabbis in Medina who accepted Islam, but of course their people didn't accept them and didn't accept the Prophet ﷺ, and of course rejected that they had any valid evidence to prove that the Prophet ﷺ was actually sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Regardless. So here, Ya Bani Israel adhkuru ni'mati, this is the context of it, is that it was actually revealed in Medina, telling to the Yahud, remember the ni'mah, remember the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had blessed you with, blessed Bani Israel with. What was the blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had blessed Bani Israel with? And what is the context of this ayah? Let's go back to actually see the reason why this ayah comes in. Let's go back to ayah, I believe, 21. Let's look at ayah 21. So in ayah 21, where is it? Right there. In ayah 21, it actually said, Ya ayyuhan nas u'budu rabbakum alladhi khalaqakum. O people, worship your Lord Almighty that created you. And it talks about the different evidence, the different bounties that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent onto the people in general, But when it talks to Bani Israel, it actually said a different thing. It actually said, Ya Bani Israel, اذكروا نعمتي التي أنعمت عليكم. When it talked to Bani Israel, it actually gave one specific ni'mah, one specific blessing.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
So let's continue right there. So when it actually talked about the Ya ayyuhan nas, directing the words at all the people, it actually mentioned a number of different bounties. When it talked about Bani Israel, it actually wanted to assign a very important bounty that others don't have or others didn't get. What was that bounty that other nations did not get? And the most important bounty was that in their lineage, the most important bounty that others didn't get is the bounty of having been chosen to carry on the message of Allah Almighty. What's the most important bounty that you can be chosen for? Is really the bounty of being chosen to carry on the legacy of all prophets. All right? This is really important. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasized this one. You carried Bani Israel, the legacy. You were chosen with multiple prophets, unlike any other nation. No other nation had received the tashrif, the honor to have been chosen to carry on the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to deliver the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like you. In other words, one of the biggest bounties that you can actually get is the bounty that you don't share with others. Everyone has. You've got water, you've got food, you've got all these. This is a bounty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed all humanity with. But one bounty that you can be chosen for is the bounty to be the person to carry on the Prophet's legacy. All right? وَأَوْفُوا بِعَهْدِي وَأَوْفُوا بِعَهْدِي. And what is the word awfu? Awfu is supposed to be when you make a promise and you fulfill that promise. That's al-wafa' bil-ahd. Al-ahd is supposed to be a promise. Al-wafa' bil-ahd is that when you fulfill a promise. What is a promise? Were the children of Israel even asked to fulfill any promise? Well, the promise is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually talked about in Surah Al-Ma'idah, in ayah, I believe 12, but if I would get to it, it's going to be really hard to find it here. In Surah Al-Ma'idah, let me just, so we can translate it really quick. Oh, where's the Quran? Hey, where's my computer? In Surah Al-Ma'idah, in ayah 12, it actually talks about the details of what is really that wafa that they were ordered to do. And of course, in the word awfu bi'ahdi, in the Quran, it actually talks about al-wafa bil-ahd. It talks about the word ahd, and it also uses the word mithaq as well. So what's the difference between al-wafa bil-ahd and al-mithaq? Really, it's the same thing, but it's actually talking about al-ahd in terms of a promise, and al-mithaq is a convent. In other words, it's actually a word that you had taken upon yourself to deliver a message, to apply a message, to live it in words. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually mentions it in Surah Al-Ma'idah, in where it gives those details. What were the details? In where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually gave them that mithaq, in where they were supposed to apply, one, they were supposed to apply the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were supposed to do iqamat salah. They were supposed to be fulfilling the laws of the Lord Almighty, which is why when you actually look at the Jewish religion, you would see that there's a lot more focus on practice than actually focus in aqida. So that's why when you're looking at awfu bi'ahdi, it actually means to live based on the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what does that mean? Awfu bi'ahdi. What is that even related with that? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told you previously of a coming prophet. Then therefore, to believe in that coming prophet is actually implementing the words of Allah Almighty. Now here, ufi bi'ahdikum, that the Lord Almighty will fulfill what He had promised you, which is what? Which is Jannah. وَإِيَّايَ فَارْهَبُونَ. وَإِيَّايَ فَارْهَبُونَ. What does that mean? إِيَّايَ means I, means the Lord Almighty. فَارْهَبُونَ. Fear Allah Almighty. Wait a minute. Fear Allah Almighty, but is fear something that I develop, or does it develop on its own? You don't decide, I'm going to get scared and do some feeling and get fear. It doesn't actually happen like that. You don't develop a feeling of fear unless you go on a roller coaster and actually develop it, but you put yourself in the circumstances to put fear in yourself if you decided that you want to feel fear. All right. And that's the same thing, is that in order to get that feeling, you have to create the atmosphere to get to that level of rahba, the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So why feel a fear of Allah and not a love of Allah? That's taqwa.
Fear helps better.
Fear helps better.
Fix
Well,
it.
it's actually in different ways. At the same time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran said, يُحِبُّهُمْ وَيُحِبُّونَ. They love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves them and they love Allah. So there are a number of different things. You will find love in the Quran, a connection between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and a believer. And there's also fear, and there's also taqwa, anywhere it's a relationship. What is that supposed to give us? Yes, there's love, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يُحِبُّهُمْ وَيُحِبُّونَ. Allah Almighty loves them and they love Allah. That they would actually fear Allah, that they would have taqwa from Allah. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in another ayat, رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is content over them and they are content over Allah. Wait, they are content over Allah? They are content over Allah. رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ. All right. So here you could see there are a number of different feelings. In other words, when do you actually develop a feeling of love, fear, all these different feelings? It's when you are close to something. When do I develop a love towards you? You don't love someone that you don't know. The closeness is what generates that feeling. So what develops a feeling of fear? When you know the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that develops fear within you.
الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
Just one last word before we actually, right there. When you look at the feelings, that actually tells us that the feelings that you generate as a result of an action, it is actually a form of tazkiyah without you realizing. It's a form of spirituality. It's a form of a spiritual connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether that was love, content, sorrow, fear, all those different feelings are actually part of tazkiyah, part of developing a relationship between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We'll continue inshallah in a bit. Inshallah. تقبل الله منك.
الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين